Hello, my most amazing artists, and welcome back to the Art Studio. Today, we're going to be talking about different drawing mediums that you can use in the art room. Here are just a few. Let's go ahead and explore those. We're going to start out by talking about colored pencils. Now, colored pencils can be used in a variety of different ways. There are a lot of techniques that you can do with them. For instance, you can shade from really, really light to going a little darker by changing the pressure that you add. So you can get a variety of different values when using your color pencils just by changing how hard you push. Another thing that you can explore using these, you can actually blend two colors together to create a gradient like this that actually blends into one another, almost like an ombre. So I'm going to get lighter in pressure here, darker in pressure here, and you can just layer. If you're not comfortable pushing hard, you can also just layer, and then when you layer, you know that your colored pencil is going to come out a lot smoother, so it takes a little bit more time and patience, but in the end, it usually ends up looking a lot nicer. So here I'm pushing hard to start off with, and then I'm gradually going to lighten up my pressure. So I'm not pushing as hard on the pencil here, and I'm blending those colors together in the middle. And then you sometimes may even need to hop back and forth until you're happy with it and how it's blending. If you still are not completely happy with the texture that you're seeing here, you're not quite getting the color you want, you may experiment, not on your final drawing, but experiment on a separate piece of paper or a test strip and try maybe using a white color pencil to blend them. This is known as burnishing. I'm demonstrating that right now by going pretty hard over that area. Yes, it does lighten it, but it also smooths it out. Another thing you can do with colored pencils, you could try some hatching, or even you could try cross hatching. And this is something that is not exclusive to just colored pencils. You can use this technique in any of these drawing mediums pretty much. And you might even try mixing those colors if you wanted. This can be an interesting way to get a lot of texture in your picture, to create shading in different ways. The closer your lines are together, the darker the value is going to appear, whereas the farther apart they are, the lighter the value will appear, especially if you're working on a really large scale. You can use this to shade. So yeah, that's basically a lot of different things you can do with colored pencils. You could try stippling by creating dots in order to create texture or shading. Like I said, we talked about blending. So there are a lot of different techniques that you can try with colored pencils, and you know, that's definitely not everything. I mean, think outside the box. What do you want to try with colored pencils? So up next, we're going to talk about pencils. And again, same thing here, but these drawing pencils, one thing to note, the number that's on them or what they say does actually matter. We're used to using what's known as a 2B pencil, but we can actually go a lot darker depending on the pencil that we're using, or a lot lighter. For instance, if you're trying to sketch something out and you don't want the lines to show up really hard, using the right pencil can really change that. And we can talk more in depth about this as we get through the year, but this is just something I want you to notice. So here I just did another gradient or a value scale. Here I am just shading really quickly, and I want you to notice that these lines are not perfect or that close together. I'm going to use something known as a blending stick or a blending tool, and I want you to notice what happens when I rub over this. Now I have a little less control over my shading, however I do have a lot of control over the smoothness, and sometimes I can even use that tool after it's been used to create marks in and of itself. Another thing that we can do with this, if I shade an area in, I can use what's known as an eraser shield. So I have something that looks like this. and it's got different slots and different holes on it, and I can erase different shapes out using this and an eraser. So right here in this area, if I want, you know what, I may go a little darker with that, just so that you can really see it well. You could try holding your pencil in different ways too. That can sometimes change an entire look of a picture. So I'm going to lay this eraser shield over top of it, almost like I'm going to use it as a stencil, but it's going to work in reverse. So here, I think I'm going to create, trying to decide on my pattern here. I'm just going to rub back and forth while holding this plate really, really still in a section that I know I want to erase. And then I'm going to try that again right here. And then let's see what we got. Now that's really small, but you can see I've erased a little smiley face out of there. Let's try another one. This can be really good for creating highlights, strong highlights in your drawing, or precise shapes in your drawing when you've already went with a really dark value. So if you're trying to get really nice shading on something, an eraser shield might be worth exploring. And then, just like with the colored pencils, all of these techniques pretty much still apply to the pencil, besides blending your colors together, because you know what the pencil is going to look like. It's just going to be that one shade. So, those are pencils and erasers. Let's talk about crayons. Okay, so now let's talk about our crayons, okay? When we're using our crayons, we can basically do all the things that we just did in addition to a few other techniques. Same thing here, you can blend from really light to really dark. A lot of people don't think about using a lot of value when they're using crayons, or a light to dark sort of shading. However, it's worth checking out because it can add a lot more interest to your picture than using just flat colors. So you can see both of those here. And again, I'm going to do a little bit of mixing, I think. So let's see if we can't just blend these two colors together. So again, changing my pressure, I can start to mix these colors and overlap them. I think oftentimes people don't experiment a lot with mixing colors with crayons, but it's really fun to try. A lot of times I even see students going back over something that they've already done and then scratching over it with their fingernail. This is a technique known as sgraffito. You could also use like a wooden stylus or something if you had one, or a popsicle stick works really well for this. It can be especially fun if you have layered two very different colors. My colors are pretty similar here, but let's see what we get. I'm gonna go pretty hard over this without trying to tear the paper. Be careful with your waxy crayons. They are made of wax. They do break pretty easy if you push hard. So if you have a heavy hand, just be cautious. If you know you have a really heavy hand and you color pretty dark, try to hold your crayon closer to the tip. That'll help support it. So here, I'm just going to use my fingernail to do some quick sgraffito. And you can see I can scratch into that and create some interesting texture too. So you can almost do a reverse drawing that way. Now, crayons are really good when used in conjunction with other things. So I'm going to show you this texture rubbing plate here can be used with it. I really like using crayons when I use texture rubbing plates. So the way that this works is I'm going to use this and slide it underneath my paper. I'm going to make sure that the rubbing plate is held really, really still. And I am going to rub over that surface, and you'll see this texture appear. Now, the texture rubbing plates can also be reversed. So even though it's the same image, if I change sides, I'm going to get a different texture than I did before. Now, these texture rubbing plates work even better if you have a peeled crayon. I don't have one of those right now, but you'll notice that if you use that way, that these lighter values don't show up, and they'll actually just give you the outline. So let's check this one out. I have a lot of these in our cabinets. You can also make these yourself, and you can find different textures around you in the world and do the same thing, as long as that surface that you're using is a hard surface. It should work. For instance, the bottom of your shoe, while it may seem kind of yucky, is a great texture most of the time, and that can be really used with something like crayons. Now, we don't just have texture rubbing plates in the art room. We also have a huge variety of stencils. And so the way a stencil works, I think most people have tried this, but just in case you haven't, I want to show you just two things here. For instance, you can go on the inside of a stencil, like that, and push against the outside edge. Notice that again, I'm holding it with my hand. You can also trace around the outside edge of a stencil while pushing up against it and following it with your pencil. You can also use the stencil holding it still, not only trace around that shape, but if you know you're trying to keep that edge really nice, you can actually use it just like this and shade that shape in while you don't even have to move the stencil. And I find this really effective when I am doing a lot of the same shapes or a lot of different shapes and I'm trying to get them down quickly, and this is really precise and more efficient. So those are stencils. Let's talk about markers and Sharpies and the differences between them. So here I have some Crayola markers. There's a lot of different kinds of markers we use in the art room. We also have fine tip markers, but I'd like to show you something. If I take this cap off, I don't want to lose it. I'm going to stick it on the back. One thing I want you to notice about these broad line markers is even though they also have this broad line if you turn them on their side, if you hold them straight up and down, you can also get a fine line. And you can do all of those same things that we just talked about, like cross hatching or stippling in order to create shading, which is where you just use a variety of dots. And you could even mix colors together like that. But one thing about mixing colors is I would never want to add yellow in on top of this blue. Because this yellow is a very light color, I always want to work light to dark, because if I don't, I will ruin my marker. And I'll demonstrate that here in a second, even though that's not what you're supposed to do. We want to see what happens. So I'm going to show you really quick though. When we're blending colors from light to dark, I can overlap them. Sometimes this works better than others. But here you can see there's a new color in the middle. If you work from light to dark, you can use markers on top of each other without damaging them. However, if I were to do this in the reverse order, and for instance, let's have a yellow circle. With some black stripes. Now let's try outlining that shape first and then going over it with a marker. Oh no. Not only is my drawing ruined, but my marker is also damaged and dirty now, and that is not what we want. So take care of the art markers, and don't forget that when you're finished, you need to snap the cap. You should hear that noise. Now, we also have Sharpie markers, okay? These are good for a number of different things. One of those things happens to be, let's say I have drawn my drawing perfectly and now I'm ready to outline it. Well, I can go back over those pencil lines with my Sharpie, and then if I see any pencil lines still showing through, I can go back and erase it because that marker is permanent. Now, this is one of those rare cases where you can actually go over a darker color. Only with Sharpie, you can go over a darker color. So if I were to color over this, notice it does not do what this does. This is a water-soluble marker. That Sharpie is a permanent marker. It's not going anywhere. We also have fine tip points. These are still Sharpie markers, but they act a lot more like pen, and they're great for getting excellent detail in your picture or something really minute or small. So those are our markers and our Sharpies. Now, let's talk a little bit about oil pastels. Same thing, these are really creamy, they're really oily. They tend to pick up other colors well, so you want to make sure that they're clean before you start. Sometimes I wipe them off on an extra sheet of paper or tissue. I know these are going to make me messy. I'm not worried about the mess on my hands. So here, let's try blending some colors together in the same way as before. But notice here, when I get to this yellow, I'm going to add a little bit less because that yellow is a really light color value. This is a really dark value. And so that means I don't need as much red as I do yellow because that red is a really strong color. So you can see a little is going to go a really long way. If I try to go over the red, it doesn't work as well. So I always want to go from light to dark. And keep in mind, if you rub over that with your hand, oil pastel does smear. Be cautious if that's not the effect you're going for. But this is worth exploring too. You can try streaking or smearing. You can try stippling. You can try mixing and blending and swirling and cross-hatching and all kinds of different textures with oil pastels. You can even make colors lighter or darker by mixing in a little bit of black. I can blend those together to make a darker brown or a darker orange, which is very similar to brown, right? Okay, another thing that I can do is just like we talked about before with the crayons, I can actually go over this with a darker color and then reveal it by scratching through. So here I'm going to use the back side of my pencil. So this can be a really, really fun trick to try. Okay, so there are a lot of different things you can do with oil pastels. Just be cautious because they break easy. They're really fun to work with. I wouldn't recommend them for things like fine details, but if you like paint, you'll probably like oil pastels. Let's talk about chalk pastels. I want you to understand that oil pastels and chalk pastels are not friends. They are not the same thing. Chalk pastels are really smooth and dusty. They're going to feel a lot different than oil pastels. They're going to feel dry. These are going to feel creamy and oily. So the chalk pastels I can use on their side like this, or I can use them like I would use any other drawing material, holding it straight up and down like this. I can also blend colors together. So if I do that here, let's try adding in some purple to the mix. Now I can do it just flat like that, or I can take my finger and go back and try not to use my oil pastel finger and blend and smooth those colors. If I take it up even higher, I can get some lighter values. Be cautious about this dust. You do not want to blow this dust into somebody's eyes. You don't want to wipe it across your paper because it's going to leave marks. Be cautious about all of those things and experiment. Chalk pastels is definitely a material that takes some getting used to. So don't be afraid to try different types of mark making. You can use the flat edge if you can get it really square. Let's see if I can do that here. in little short strokes and create really interesting textures by using some analogous colors or colors that are close to each other in the rainbow or color wheel. And one really interesting thing about chalk pastels is you can actually do exactly what you do with pencils using an eraser. You can erase chalk pastels. Now, they don't always erase completely, but you can, in fact, erase them. And this can create highlights in your work, just like we were talking before. So, those are all of our drawing media that we're going to explore in our first week of drawing. And these are going to be available to you in our drawing studio at all times. So I hope you have fun exploring different drawing media and finding what works for you.